Today, Keir Starmer will reiterate calls for an immediate ceasefire in the Middle East as Israel marks a year since the Hamas attack and as 97 hostages remain held in Gaza.
We are joined by the Defence Secretary John Healey from the Ministry of Defence this morning. Mr Healey, good morning to you on what is a horrific morning which reverberates throughout the Jewish community here in the UK a year on. I just want to talk to you about where the government stands. After the attacks back in October, Keir Starmer seemed to suggest that Israel had a right to put Gaza under siege, and the party didn't immediately back a ceasefire. Now, a year on, we have the message we stand with Israel, but back in September, you suspended 30 arms exports to Israel out of a total of 350, while saying that the country has a right to defend itself. Have you got a clear message this morning?
The message has been consistent from that horrifying day a year ago today when we saw the Hamas terror attacks, and it was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And that message has been very clear. We will stand with Israel. We utterly recognise and support their right to self-defence and to security. But we will urge whatever they do, including going after their hostages in Gaza, is done within international law. And the discussions I've had with the Israeli Defence Minister and government has at all levels consistently says they must do more to reduce the level of civilian casualties in Gaza. And when we mark today also the conflict, the killing in the wider war in the Middle East, this has got to be a day when we redouble our efforts to find a ceasefire and a push for peace for the longer term as well.
I think the thing which people will find hard to understand, Defence Secretary, is last week you were in Cyprus talking about our Typhoon jets backing there to help Israel, to defend Israel. But at the same time, you've suspended export licences to Israel because you fear that Israel is breaking international law. If Israel is breaking international law, why is British military firepower being used to defend them?
So in Gaza, we've urged restraint. We've urged Israel to do more to reduce the level of civilian casualties. And we've, as a government, followed the established system we've got here of suspending a small number of arms export licences for equipment that could be used in Gaza in clear risk of a potential breach of international law. None of that qualifies or compromises our steadfast support for Israel, their right to defend themselves, their right to security. And long term, our argument with Israel is the same as it is with the Gulf states that I visited, David Lammy has visited, and the government talks to, which is that really this is a region that cannot suffer another year like the last one. We must have a path to peace. There's a UN plan on the table for Lebanon. If Lebanon's Hezbollah will stop their missiles and pull back, Israel must do the same. And that, in the end, is the way for the displaced Israeli families, 60,000 of them, to be able to return home safely to northern Israel, and for the Lebanese to be able to do the same. Diplomacy is difficult, but we won't give up, particularly as the stakes are so high.
We've got a lot to get through. Let me just ask you, I mean, you, I would say, over the last few months, have had a pretty sure-footed arrival, Defence Secretary, complex brief, clear messaging. It must be so frustrating for you as the new Defence Secretary to see the chaos and confusion and now the removal of the Downing Street's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray. I mean, what's been going on in Downing Street?
Well, you know as well as anyone that people in the end judge governments by what they do and not what they say. And you look at this government and it's been one getting on the job really from day one. We've launched Great British Energy for cheaper, greener power. We've set up a new border security command. We've got NHS doctors back on the wards. We've introduced legislation for new renters' rights to take the rail network back into public ownership. And
the
an armed
sacking of
forces
Sue Gray is
to
complete
improve
chaos. I mean,
service life.
But you'd have to admit, the sacking of Sue Gray, complete chaos.
Oh, look, Sue Gray made a massive contribution to helping prepare us for government. But she said yesterday, and she's right, she risked becoming a distraction from the work of change that the government must pursue. And Keir Starmer's got a strong team at number 10, strong team in government and in Parliament. And what you've seen over the last 3 months, you'll see in the next 3 weeks. Later this week, the largest levelling up of workers' rights in a generation, followed by an international investment conference to bring in the investment to grow the economy, and then a budget to deal with the...
These are the things that you're hoping people will talk about. The fact of the matter is, I'll tell you, there's one issue that is dominating our coverage, and that is the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance. Now, in the past couple of days, you told Ed Balls this.
The only people so far who've been asked to pay a price by the Labour government to lose money is pensioners on £12,000 a year. I mean, where's the fairness in that?
Across the board, whether it's transport, health, or in our schools, including and particularly the health service, which many pensioners depend on, if we're going to rebuild the strength of our public services for the long term, it's the people who work in this that are most important.
Which sounded very much like you're putting working people's interests above those of people who have worked all of their lives and are now getting hundreds of pounds taken away from them.
No, I'm proud to be part of a government that has recognised the central role that our public service workers play if we want to rebuild public services for the long term.
Pensioners.
I'm proud to be a Defence Secretary, the first that can say every one of those people serving in uniform now will at least earn the national living wage.
I'm talking about pensioners.
No, indeed you are. And the announcement of the winter fuel allowance was an indication back in July of the measure of the black hole that we face, the tough steps that will have to be taken later in this month at the budget.
And you're making pensioners pay.
This is part of fixing the foundations both for our economy and long-term for our public services. And people in the end will judge a government on what we do. They'll do so over the next 2 to 3, 4 years, not just the first 3 months. And Keir Starmer is a Prime Minister that is absolutely determined to deliver the work of change that this country has elected us to do.
Not changing your mind on what you're doing to pensioners?
Well, on pensioners, one of the drives that the government has led since the end of July is to make sure that many more of the 800,000 people who have a right to claim pension credit and therefore the full winter fuel allowance are getting those entitlements. That's going up. I'm glad to see that. But I also want to see us rebuild public services. I want us to see a Britain that is successful in the future with an economy that grows, because that's the way that we all will benefit.
OK. Thank you very much indeed, Mr Healey. It's interesting that you mentioned the armed forces. Neil has got in touch via email. Due to me serving in the armed forces and protecting this country, I'm being punished by the Labour government with the withdrawal of the winter allowance. Thank you very much indeed.